Hi, everyone. This is the first of two PowerPoints covering the civil rights movement in the 1960s. Civil rights movement was significant for so many reasons. It was the largest mass social movement in 20th century American history. And it had a profound impact not only on issues of race, issues of civil rights in the United States, but it influenced other movements that developed in the wake of the civil rights movement, everything from the anti-Vietnam War movement to the women's movement, gay rights movement, all drew upon the example of the civil rights movement. And it's important to remember, as I mentioned to the class, that the civil rights movement would not have existed and would not have occurred without the sacrifice and the risks taken by a lot of ordinary people. We tend to think of the civil rights movement in terms of leadership, people like Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, but it's critically important to remember the participation of many ordinary people who risked their education, their jobs, and their lives in order to achieve change. So this PowerPoint's going to start with the first portion of the civil rights movement from 1960 to 1963. So let's get started. Key figure in the movement, as I just mentioned, of course, Martin Luther King Jr. And we had talked about his role with the Montgomery bus boycott and how that made him quite unexpectedly a national figure. King wrote a book about that experience, Stride Toward Freedom, that was tremendously impactful for younger Black Americans, many of whom would become involved in the civil rights movement as college students in the early 60s. So in 1960, King returns to his hometown of Atlanta and establishes SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and this was the organization on whose behalf King would do his civil rights work and organizing in the 1960s. And SCLC operated on the principle of King's protest philosophy of nonviolent direct action protest. This was going to be extremely influential too. At the same time, in 1960, Black college students really ignited the civil rights movement with the first sit-ins, the first one happening at a Woolworth store lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina in 1960, organized and led by students from North Carolina A&T University in Greensboro. The tactic of sit-ins dated back to World War II. They had first been used to protest segregated conditions. So these students were reviving that tremendously effective form of protest. Extremely dignified, but also extremely dangerous. And it was a visible way of communicating that we are not going to be bound by these racist social norms. I explained to the class, Woolworth doesn't even exist as a chain anymore, but it was a store that was kind of a hybrid of a small-scale Target and a smaller CVS. So it was kind of a drugstore, but kind of a budget department store too. You could purchase a little bit of everything in there. And as was common with stores in this era, they usually had a dining area or a cafeteria type setting where shoppers could eat lunch primarily. We really don't have this sort of thing left anymore. I guess, Target and some other stores have that area toward the front where you can buy hot dogs and soda and popcorn and that sort of thing. That's about the closest we have to what this was. But this set an example that electrified black students throughout the South who began organizing sit-ins in other locations. And it was a woke moment for white college students around the country as well, many of whom had been completely unaware that these conditions existed in the South. Public segregation and the way it worked in these facilities that students are protesting, black customers not allowed to sit at the counter for service, but had to sit toward the back at tables designated strictly for black customers. So that's what these students are challenging. And the sit-ins stimulated the formation of a new civil rights movement, SNCC. SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, established by black college students who held a convention in 1960. SNCC became one of the most influential civil rights organizations. We read its brief but powerful founding statement. It was inspired by and based on King's ideas, his protest philosophy of direct action, nonviolent protest. Difference, as I explained to class, between SNCC and King's organization, SCLC, is that SNCC believed in training local people in techniques of protest and organization, preparing them to plan, launch, and carry out their own campaigns, but without SNCC coming in and leading it for them. They would lead it themselves. So it's a very grassroots, organic, from the bottom up approach, much more holistic than King's organization, which was based more on a leadership from the top down philosophy of SCLC coming in, organizing campaigns and running them. So SNCC's approach was different, although the two groups frequently collaborated. King's organization organized protests in Birmingham in 1963 that were going to be critically important. As I explained to the class, these expanded the agenda of the civil rights movement. So in the 50s, the civil rights movement had targeted segregated education, segregated public schools, demanding quality education for black students in America. Then in the 60s, you get the movement building off really what had also happened in the 50s with the Montgomery bus boycott, protesting segregated seating on buses. And now in the 60s, with the sit-ins, demonstrations led by SNCC and King's organization, you get the movement expanding to confront and combat public segregation in general and the conditions that were pervasive in the American South, where any sort of public facility had segregated seating, segregated bathrooms, water fountains, all that sort of thing. So now in Birmingham, King targets the business district in downtown Birmingham, which businesses there had longstanding discriminatory hiring practices, even though black residents in Birmingham spent millions of dollars in the downtown business district annually. You couldn't find a black person working a sales counter. Black residents were relegated to lower paying jobs frequently where they were less visible, working in stock rooms, working as custodians, working in kitchens, not working counters in department stores and other businesses, jewelers, things like that in downtown Birmingham. So that's what King's protest in Birmingham is designed to call attention to, these sorts of discriminatory hiring practices, which were common in the South and not uncommon in the North, for that matter, either. City officials in Birmingham responded with force, fire hoses, police dogs, mass arrests, and these images were televised across the nation and around the world, and the brutality shocked the American public. At a point I mentioned in class, during the height of the Cold War, when the United States is presenting itself as the beacon of freedom and democracy, these images of how peaceful demonstrators were treated really damaged America's reputation around the world. King himself was arrested and jailed, and it's during this period of solitary confinement that he secretly composes and smuggles out his eloquent letter from Birmingham jail, which is an articulation of his protest philosophy. And he argues that racism in all forms, anywhere, was harmful to the nation as a whole, as indicated on this slide. He says in his letter, "I'm in Birmingham because injustice is here, and injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." Beautifully composed document that conveyed to the larger American public his philosophy of protest. And so John Kennedy, who had done nothing really in regard to civil rights, despite promising to do so when he ran for election in 1960, is forced to respond, and he introduces sweeping civil rights legislation that proposed banning all forms of public segregation. This becomes the basis of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Kennedy was unable to get this moved through Congress. It stalled there at the time of his death. Lyndon Johnson is going to take up that challenge and successfully get it passed. But this is one of the key results of the Birmingham campaign, pressuring John Kennedy to respond and take decisive action. So we see over the course of these first 3 years in the 60s, civil rights movement expanding, first confronting public segregation, then expanding to confront discriminatory hiring practices, and placing sufficient pressure on the existing presidential administration of John Kennedy that Kennedy has to respond. And the March on Washington that occurs during the period when this bill is being debated, this is the event that's tended to demonstrate massive public support for Kennedy's proposed legislation. 250,000 people turn out for this event. And it's here that King delivers the best remembered address of all his speeches, the "I Have a Dream" speech. People tend to focus on the closing part of the speech, where King talks about a colorblind society, and they tend to overlook the earlier portions of the speech, the very harsh critique of racism in the United States in 1963. But this event demonstrated King's influence, prestige, and at this point, most people acknowledged him as the overall leader of the civil rights movement.